Hi everyone, InDesign 1 with Donna Caldwell. We are at week 6. This is webcast 2, and as promised we are continuing with the theme of tabs and frames. Tonight what I want to do is go back, address some questions that I've had that came in previously to the, obviously you guys haven't seen the first webcast of this week. Or, I mean, at this point that I'm recording this one, sorry about that. But I've had some questions just to clarify fills, and so I'm going to try to work some of that into tonight's webcast as well. I also want to go back through what I discussed in webcast 1 and just provide a few more details, which I'm hoping will make the assignment much easier and again, keep creating this foundation that I'm hoping you guys can all jump forward with and start doing wonderful creative projects, or just doing a really detailed job on what projects you have that you need to complete. All right, we're going to go back to the same demo file. And I want to say a couple more things about these frames. Next week we are going to get into more specifics about text frames. We're going to have several podcasts, webcasts I mean, or at least an hour's worth of just really delving into graphic frames. And also start talking about gridified objects. And some of it will be a redo of what I'm talking about tonight. But I just think these points are so important that they need to be reviewed a couple of times throughout, and I know that there will still be questions about many of the items that we're talking about, because this is the nuts and bolts of InDesign. Why would you be using InDesign if you didn't want to somehow integrate text and images? That's the whole reason that we create advertisements, that we create apps, and that we do a lot of what we do in either advertising, marketing, or technical documentation for that matter. So here we go. When you have created a graphic frame and filled it with something, and let's just use this one, this circle here as an example. I have a image that is sitting in this frame, and I purposely wanted this in a circle so that it was real clear which is the frame and which is the edge of the image. So the frame is what is going to have the ability to crop the image or to provide extra white space around it. But the image itself, as you can see, does not correspond to this shape. Images will always come in with a square bounding box, as I've mentioned before. But once I deselect that image and I go back and click on an area that's not near the little donut, you can see that here we are selecting with the blue, which is telling me that not only is this a frame, but it's also telling me when we get into layers, you'll find out that that is the color associated with this layer. By default, everything you create when you first open up InDesign sits on a generic layer, and it always has a color indicator of this exact blue. So as I've mentioned before, by either using the content grabber and clicking on that, or as we talked about the alternative to the content grabber, going to the direct selection tool, which is the hollow tipped arrow to the right of the selection tool. And if you hover over, it will always clarify for you which tool you're on. So you can see the dark one has the pop-up as selection tool, and the one to the right is the direct selection tool. They have two different key activators. The direct selection tool can be selected with the letter A, and the solid arrow can be selected with the letter V, or if you are currently typing in a text box, by pressing the escape key. I will be going over that again when we start talking about text boxes in more detail, because that's when it'll start making, I think it'll make more sense. All right, so I'm in the direct selection tool, which is not going to allow me to select this frame as a single unit unless I can click right in the center. And right now, this image is blocking me from clicking right in the center. So whatever I click on here is going to focus on that image. And before we had the content grabber, this was the world that we lived in. And I can move that around just like I can with the content grabber. Hence, I think it's real easy to see why Adobe wanted to put that modification in as a new feature, because to get out of this, I either had to press the V key, deselect, go back out and select the selection tool, or we used to have a way that we could go in and out by double clicking, and that has changed. That functionality has changed. For example, if I'm in the selection tool and I double click, traditionally InDesign always switched tools for you. Just like if I click up here and then I double click in this text box, what happened? InDesign switched me from my selection tool to my type tool. But that's no longer the case any longer. When we double click in here, instead InDesign gives me the functionality of the direct selection tool without the content grabber or without changing tools. So to a new user, I think this adds more layers of complexity when really down the road you are just going to see this different color, you're going to see the shape of the image, and you're not even going to think about it. Your hands are just going to move with it. How do I get out of this now? I'm already in the selection tool, and yet I'm dealing with the content. I'm going to have to select off of that image by clicking outside of the image. Doesn't necessarily have to be outside of the frame. It just has to be outside the image. And now it's behaving just like the selection tool would behave. I've got the bounding box showing for this frame, and I can see that the entire frame is selected. Just a sec. Sorry guys, I've been coughing today, and I'm not sick, but I know that hearing someone cough over the microphone is probably a bit aggravating. Okay, again, another reminder. If I am going to change the size of this frame, I don't want to change it just by dragging, because I'm not going to be able to keep the proportions of that frame, unless that's your intention. You may decide that instead of a circle, an oval would have been a much better idea for this container. I'm just going to press Control Z or Command Z to get back to the circle that I had. This time I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and of course that frame now resizes proportionally. I'm going to make it just a hair bigger so that I get from the tip of the little toy's nose all the way to the tip of its tail. It's completely showing. Another thing I want to clarify, and I'm going to use this shape up here to explain this. As we discussed in the last webcast, these are open paths. But if you fill an open path, you'll see that it will go to the edge of that opening, and then it closes off the fill. It doesn't close off the path. I'm going to increase the size of this stroke just so that it's real clear that this is an open path. And just like a closed path, I can import an image. Let me just bring in that little horse here. And you can see that how much bigger it is than that. So I'm going to right click, go to my fitting command, and choose Fit Content Proportionally, because I want the entire toy to fit inside of this shape. And you can see that I still have this background color. So here's another thing. Just because you have filled a frame with an image doesn't mean you can't have a background color. So let's go back down to this frame that has no fill, just has a black stroke. And while I have it selected, I'm going to go to my swatches panel, maybe choose something that might complement this, maybe a lighter yellow. I'm going to lighten that yellow. It's a little bit too strong by going to the tint portion of my swatches panel and dragging that slider down until I have something that's not quite as dark. That's at 54% of the color. Remember, that is still opaque. This is not transparency. If I put this over the top of another item, it's going to block that out. So here's another thing that can happen. I'm going to replace this image with one that will take up the entire shape after I increase its size real quickly. And now I've completely covered up that maroon background. And if I am not careful, I'm going to forget that this image frame has a maroon background. I look over here, and sure enough, it's still a maroon background, even though I am not seeing evidence of that. But it's not a good idea to have that filled with a maroon background. So if I was going to keep this image, and it was going to obscure everything in that frame or that open path, I would probably go back at that point and make the fill none. At any point, I can click on a frame or a frame that has content. Doesn't matter if it's a text frame or an image frame. It doesn't matter if it's a closed path or an open path. If I hit my backspace key or my delete key, I'm going to remove that object from the file. I'm just going to press Control Z here. And as I said, that's going to be the same for any open path. I have another open path here. I'm going to import, let's see, I bring in this cast iron tea maker. Again, I'm going to right click, go to the fitting command, and choose fill frame proportionally, and then maybe move this around a little bit so I could get more of my tea kettle. And I might need to enlarge this a little bit. And now all of the maroon is obscured, except in this case I'm seeing, well, actually it's probably an optical illusion, or it may just be that the pixels aren't showing right. But and when I was zoomed out, I saw a little tiny line of maroon pixels. And yet when I zoom in, oops, there it is. Can you see that right here? But when I'm zooming back out, at different zoom settings, it's going away and reappearing. So it's probably a good idea for me to remove that maroon background since it's not adding anything to this image. All right. I want to focus just for a few moments on the commands that can change the content. So let's say that I drew an ellipse, and let me just place this over here. So it's going to look very much like the one I just scrolled away from, and I draw a frame. And it has the X through it because I chose the frame tool, right, instead of the ellipse or the polygon or the rectangle tool over here. I'm going to go, now that the object is drawn, and I want to make a comment about this. So often, I was just teaching a class the other day, and my students were drawing an object, and then they would try to move it with the same key without switching out of this. And then they would draw another little one, and then they'd go, oh no, that's not what I want to do, I want to move this. And then they would draw another object. And before you know it, you go over to help them, and they have 15 objects stacked on top of each other. And it's not that they were doing anything wrong. That was the tool that they should be using to draw this object. It's just that once it's drawn, you have to remember to go out of that tool. And we'll get back to that in a little bit too. Let's say that I want this to contain text. I can place text in here just by clicking on the type tool and clicking in this frame, and now it's converted to a text container, a text frame essentially. But if I change my mind, I'm going to change back to the selection tool, and I'm going to go to the Object menu and choose Content, Graphic. Then I get my placeholder frame back, and if I change it yet again to Unassigned, this is exactly what I would get if I chose the Ellipse tool and just drew a shape. One of the differences, which I think is kind of interesting, is if you draw any vector shape, by default it has a black stroke and no fill, just as what we're seeing right here. But if you draw a frame, and this originally was a frame, it has no fill and no stroke, probably because it's designed to be a container and not everybody wants a stroke around their image. And even though I turned it back to unassigned, it kept the properties of no fill and no stroke. So if you turn your frame edges off, so if I go to View, Extras, and I hide frame edges, I will not see any object that I've drawn which does not have a stroke. And that's why I always really push my new users of InDesign that at least until you're really comfortable with trusting yourself. You may look at this and say, oh man, I thought for sure I drew a circle here. Where is it? As an experienced user, you would say, of course I did. It's here somewhere, and I'm just going to do a drag select, and whoa, there it is, sure enough. And I can give it a stroke, and it's there. But as a beginning user, you might question yourself and think, okay, I need to draw another one. So you would go back to that frame, which by default would have no fill and no stroke. You would draw another one, and then when you deselect, it would disappear too. So to make life easier for you at first, I would always make sure that your frame edges were turned on. And then all of a sudden, all of these pieces appear. A quick review of frames. We're going to get into another drawing feature, but I just want to remind everyone that if you have created an object, and I just mentioned a few minutes ago that if I want to resize it, I'm going to hold down my Shift key, which will keep it proportional. And that's going to be true about drawing a new object, right? We have mentioned this. If I want to draw a circle instead of an ellipse, I need to hold that Shift key down, and no matter how much I move my mouse around, all it's going to do is get smaller or larger. It's never going to distort out of its circle form. So the Shift key is my constraining tool. All right, we're going to start talking a little bit more about drawing objects. So for this, I'm going to move over here for just a few moments so we have a clean drawing area. And I want to talk a little bit about how we place an object on the page. As simple as it may seem, some of us are not quite sure what's the best way to do that. I'm going to go back to my rectangle tool for a moment. Most of us draw an object, create an object, and this is a path or a frame, by dragging diagonally. Now whether I hold down my Shift key or not is obviously going to keep that proportional, but the fact is that unless I drag, I'm not going to get the shape to appear in front of me. But I'm going to delete this. I can also go the other direction. I can start from any corner and draw. For instance, I just drew from the bottom right-hand corner up to the top left-hand corner. And sometimes I'll do that if I'm getting too close to an object. For example, let's say that I needed to have a frame right up against this text box. I may not want to start it here because my cursor is kind of jumping around as it's getting close to this text box, and that may not be coming across in the webcast. So actually it would be more likely that I would be in this situation. I might start it lower on the page and then draw up to have a little bit more control of how close that gets. So it's just going to depend on what object you're drawing and whether it's filled with something, whether you're trying not to overlap it, it's up to you. But I just want everyone to know that no matter what direction you come from, that image or that object is going to be drawn. Now some of us don't want to draw from the top left corner down to the right, because then we realize, wow, this isn't centered on the page. How could I have done that a little bit better? Now what I have to do is let go of my mouse, go back to my selection tool, and then move it until it's centered. If I know that I want an object to be centered on a particular spot, so let's say that I draw a, oops, I'm not supposed to get to that yet, hang on. I draw a little tiny ellipse, and I'm going to fill that, let's say, with a little shade of blue here. And then I decide that I want a rectangle around this. So if I want this blue dot, and you're not able to see that real quickly if I deselect, okay. If I want this to be the center of my box, I can always draw the rectangle, and then I can move it, make these two align to their centers. But if you want to draw from the center out, you can hold down your Alt key. And now my shape is growing from the center. Ooh, but it's not making it proportional. So with my Alt key still depressed, I'm going to add the Shift key. And as I draw, notice not only is it centered pretty closely on that little circle, it's growing from the center and it's growing proportionally. And I might be slightly off, but I have a much better idea of what my distance is, instead of trying to start up here and go, okay, let's see, I want this to be, I'm not sure exactly, and maybe this is off now, needs to go up a little bit. And though we have another key, which I just snuck in there, and I'll mention this briefly, but then I'll bring it up again when we're into frames next week. Let's say that I meant this to be centered on this dot. So I hold down my Alt key and I start to draw. I hold down my Shift key to make it proportional, but very quickly I see that I've misjudged the center of this little dot. With my Shift key and my Alt or my Option key, if you're on the Mac, this would be your Option key. And I've got to think about this ahead of time. So I have like my ring finger on the Shift key, my middle finger on the Alt or Option key, and now if I hold down my space bar, it stops the sizing of the object and lets me move it around while I'm still drawing it. This is exactly how this works in Illustrator as well. It gives me a chance to readjust where the center of this is. Now I keep my Alt and my Shift key down, or I keep my Option and my Shift key down. I let go of the space bar, and now I'm back into creation mode. And yet I didn't have to do this by going back to my selection tool, re-grabbing a corner, and then trying to resize it. Okay, now I'm in a situation again where I'm thinking I don't want this to resize just to the right and the bottom, and I definitely don't want it to resize just from the top and the left. How can I resize this from the center? And I can do that just the way I created it. Place my cursor over a corner handle, which allows you to size vertically and horizontally at the same time. Hold down my Shift key, but I'm also going to hold down my Alt key. And now as it resizes from the center. And I can see that I'm just a little bit off center here, so I'm going to hold down that space bar. Oh, and actually I forgot, unless you're creating a box or in an object, you can't use the space bar as a movement key. So I'm going to have to, I would have to select these two and I would have to align them. Which we'll get into those keys later, but we have little icons for these. Align left, center, right, top, vertical center, vertical bottom, and then we also have distribute commands. And depending on what I have is what it's supposed to align to, which I want it, in this case, to align to the selection. I don't care about the other objects on the page at the moment. Then I could say I want these vertically centered and horizontally centered. And now I know this is spot on. Okay, another way to draw any one of these objects, regardless of whether it's a frame or if it's a path, is instead of dragging, just place your cursor where you want that object to be created and just click on the page. And a dialog box appears asking what dimensions you want this to be. So let's say that I want it to be 1.5 inches, and I don't know what that is in picas, let's say. I go 1.5, either INI or inch mark, and by 1.5 inches. And boom, there I have a frame exactly the size I'm looking for. This is often really helpful if you're following the instructions of a particular graphic designer who has spec'd out a project for you. This is also helpful if you know that you want a 4x6 image to fit in there exactly, or a 7x9, or an 8.5 by 11. And instead of dragging it, you know you will get the exact size you need, and then you can move it where it's supposed to be on the page. Let me try that one more time. Let me do this with a different shape this time. Let's do it with the ellipse tool. Place it over a blank area. Click. And I'm going to make this 12 picas by 12 picas. And there's my circle. And it doesn't have to be proportional either. I can click and say, actually I want this to be 4 by 12. And the reason I don't have to put the P is because, remember, if it's the default measurement system, I don't need an indicator. It's only if I'm going to override that default measurement system. Click OK, and now I get this oval, which is anything but proportional. And you can see that I'm using that method I recommended before, where I'm placing my cursor over the center after it's selected, because I can drag it that way. If I select something and then click in here to drag, what's going to happen? It's going to deselect. So I often use a marquee to click on something, especially if it has a very narrow stroke, or it has no stroke in this case. So I'm trying to grab this little edge of a frame, and let's say that I'm zoomed out pretty far. It's not easy to grab that. So I usually just start outside the image, drag inside, just across that border. It selects it, then I can go right to that center dot, which I find very easy to move to be able to see my frame as I'm positioning it around the page. All right, so we've talked about content, we've talked about creating. Let's go into a couple of other things. I mentioned the pencil tool in the previous webcast, but I want to say a couple more things about this tool. I have to admit I never use this tool, but some people really like it. And I use it because even with a Wacom tablet and a stylus, which simulates a pen, if any of you who are not familiar with a Wacom tablet, you have a tablet that sits in front of you, and then you have a pen tool. It's not a real pen, but it looks like a pen. You call it a stylus. And you can draw with it. And it's much easier for the hand, at least most illustrators I know, it's much easier for them to draw and work in graphic programs with the stylus rather than with a mouse, because your hand is in a different position, one that we have not been raised since we were toddlers to use. I think that is changing, and I would be really interested in another 40 years to see what this generations of toddlers who I see using their parents' iPhones in the grocery store when they're 3 years old. This is going to be a very different training ground for them. And by then, you know, we may have completely different tools to create creative projects too. So who knows? But anyway, getting back to this pencil tool, if I draw a circle, and it's horrible. I know how horrible I'm drawing here to try to do this with my mouse. And I think I've closed that path. I'm going to zoom in real quickly. And I can see, nope, I got close, but I did not close this path. This is an open path. And in some cases, I'm going to need that closed path. So I'm going to try this again. I'm going to delete this, set up a default of a black stroke. by bringing the stroke icon in front, clicking on my default black color down here. It always shows you the last few colors that you have used in addition to none. So this is just a quick way to click on a swatch without going over to your swatches panel. They're essentially the exact same thing. The none swatch here is the exact same none swatch here. The black is exactly the black here. And the blue gradient just happens to be one of the last things that I chose, and that is exactly the blue gradient over here. So here's my pencil tool, and I'm going to try this circle again. But this time, as I get close to the beginning of that path, I'm going to hold down, what am I going to hold down? I just did this a couple minutes ago. I'm going to hold down my Alt key or the Option key on a Mac, and notice the difference in the symbol. Do you see the little, I don't know if that's coming through. It's not coming through on my second monitor, so I'm not sure if it's going to come through with the webcast. But where I'm seeing a little black dot, or it was a plus sign in the bottom right-hand corner, I'm seeing a little circle, which is the indicator that you are closing a path manually. And now if I zoom in, I can see that even though these were closed, and actually I turned that off and on, so this may not actually be completely closed. I'm seeing a slight little breakdown here at the bottom. So let me, because I kept lifting my key up and down, let's try this again. I'm going to draw, hold down my Alt key, let go, zoom in, and I can see that my pencil only made it to here. This was the beginning over here, so there was this distance between these 2 points, and InDesign connected them because I held down that Alt key. Now I don't think you are seeing the stylus icon or the pencil icon through the webcast. I've noticed when I've watched webcasts that it's not indicating a tool. Instead, I'm just seeing a little pointer, very similar to what I see here in this selection box. So you'll want to try this so that you're sure that you can see that tool. All right, now the pencil tool has some other kind of interesting qualities to it. I'm going to draw a circle from the inside out. And if that circle is selected, I can move over to the pencil tool, and I can modify its shape by engaging with the path, going out, drawing, and then coming back and engaging again with that path. And when I let go, the circle has turned into this, whatever it is. And I think this also demonstrates why we don't use the pencil tool to draw precise elements. And it's because it leaves too many anchor points. I don't know if you guys can see this area right here. Let me zoom in. See if I can click on this. And you can see how many of these anchor points it has stacked for this, just this little area. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me zoom out a little bit. Oops. Let me find another area that's really, and see, it's just there's way too many of these anchor points. And these anchor points are creating little jaggies in here because it was trying to be responsive to my wrist on my mouse, which was pretty bad. So underneath the pencil tool, we have what's called a smooth tool. And if I keep taking my pencil and going over the stroke, you can see that it starts removing these and it starts smoothing out the path. But it takes quite a few movements along that path to do this. And I'm doing this over here. You can also change the properties of the smooth tool by double-clicking on it. And there are tolerances here, smoothness, which you can see is pretty low because we're trying to keep the fidelity of the pixels within 5 pixels. So for the default case, if you don't modify these preferences, it's going to take quite a few strokes over the top of this path to get it to do what you want it to do in order to smooth it. But I just wanted you to know that that is there. We also have, underneath the pencil tool, an erase tool. And if I go over the top of this, you can see that I'm breaking the path. And here's a pixel that, a little piece of it that just got left out. It's not a pixel, it's an anchor point. I want to make sure I don't make anyone misunderstand that. And I've deselected it by clicking off of it. So I need to go back, and I can then go back to the eraser tool and continue erasing this. It's pretty time-consuming and extremely detail-oriented to try to do something with this tool, which is why I don't use it. But you can have a lot of fun with this too, and depending on what your creative bent is, you might find some awesome thing to do with this. I'm going to go back so that this is a full closed path. Select it. I just pressed Control-V several times, and you can see that I can fill this. I can even put a shape inside, maybe a couple of eyes, whatever the case may be. So that's a little bit more on the pencil tool. I want to talk also a little bit more about the convert shape. So I'm going to remove this for the moment. I'm going to place an image just using the keyboard shortcut Control-D. And I'm looking for Photoshop. That's the one I'm looking for. If anyone likes the tropics, here we go. Some palm trees and a hammock and beautiful ocean out there and a sand beach. I talked in the previous webcast about converting shapes. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to create multiples of these. And just to remind people of what I'm doing, when you hold down the Option or Alt key, notice that and you're not seeing this in the webcast, your arrowhead turns into a double-headed arrowhead. It looks like it has a shadow. The top one is solid black. The bottom one has a black stroke, but it's white on the inside. That is the clue that if you drag this object, you will not be dragging the original, but instead a copy of it. And then I quickly hold down my Shift key to keep it going exactly perpendicular. And we talked about this when we were discussing footers. I'm going to do this one more time. And then I'm going to go and use the Convert Shape tool. Because when I was doing this before, I was doing most of it with an empty frame, and I want you to see how it still works even if you have content in it. I'm going to choose the Object menu, go to Convert Shape, and maybe I'm going to choose the beveled rectangle. And if I deselect, I can see that this image now has this strong angular corners. I can click on this one and go again to Object, Convert Shape, and this time I'm going to change this to a triangle. We also talked about the ability to change corners, which can be very similar. If I undo both of these changes and I click on this object, go to my Object menu, choose Corner Options, and then I link the top corners and the bottom corners all together. There's my little chain link telling me that if I change one of these, it changes all of them. I can go to my bevel, and that's exactly the same shape I was just looking at when I used the Convert Shape. So it just depends on how much you're trying to change. The nice thing about this command with Corner Options is that I have more flexibility about how to change and how much I want to change and what corners I want to change. If that bevel is not enough for me, if I look at this and think that's just not dramatic enough, no one will know those are beveled corners, I can increase this And of course, it's nice to have some of the other options. I can go to my fancy and increase this. Not that I would want to do this with a design, but you can see how much of a difference this makes. And we also mentioned in the previous webcast that I can choose to allow each of these to behave separately from the other. So maybe I want the top right to be fancy, and can everybody see that little blue dot in the upper right hand corner? That's keying me into the fact that what I do in this field will impact the upper right hand corner, upper left, lower left, and lower right. Plus they've tried to place these fields in a logical place within a rectangle, right? If we drew a rectangle around these fields, this would be the top left, top right, right? Okay. So in this case, maybe I want the bottom left to have none, and maybe the top left, I change that to a rounded corner. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I used the convert shape, because it would take all 4 corners and change them at the same time. All right. We will be getting into text wrap in the next webcast, because that's going to be absolutely imperative for you to complete your assignment. And you won't have as many text details, text box details, as I want you to have in the end, but I want to be sure that you can get through this. And we're only asking a single square, I'm only asking for a single text box square, which I think all of you can muster up. So if you go down to a page that doesn't have any text, I think all of you at this point can take your type tool and draw a rectangle of some size, and then we can import text into that. And we'll be getting into that in more detail on the Thursday night webcast. But just in case anybody is concerned about wanting to get a head start on this, you can copy and paste text from a text program. So for instance, if I wanted to go back out to my Finder, I could just open that text file in any application, Microsoft Word, TextEdit, Notepad, whatever I opened the text file in, and I can copy and I can paste it. And it'll just fill in very similar to this placeholder text. At this point, I can highlight it by pressing Control-A or Command-A on the Mac, change whatever font, size, line spacing, things that I want to do. But remember, you've got to be sure when we start using text wrap that you haven't pushed all the text out of that bottom right-hand corner. There's not enough room for it. Now you're only going to be given 3 paragraphs for this travel, these 2 travel flyers. So you shouldn't have any problem making the text fit within the box. And you'll just need to drag one of the corners just like you would have framed this. In this case, you probably won't want to make it proportional because you're either trying to make it a little bit wider or a little bit deeper. But at some point, you should be able to make it large enough that it's not the image, even with the image there and the text wrapping around it, it should fit in that box. Now I want to cover one last thing that's really kind of fun because everybody wants to do this. There is one other type of frame that we have in InDesign. And this frame is created by outlining text. I will go into a lot more detail on this feature, but this is a huge question that people always ask me in beginning classes. How can I have an image inside of text? Well, what we've done is we have changed it from type to a set of frames that work together because they were together in the text box. And I'll go into more detail in another webcast about how I could do a separate image in each one of these. But to get to this point, I'm going to, and I want to prove to you first that this is editable type. I'm going to place my cursor here, backspace over the A, type the A again. Oh, and of course now it's not fitting. So I'm going to have to Oh, and maybe gosh, did I add something else to this? I don't think so. Oh, it's because I had tracked it, so please don't watch me do this. I'm tracking and kerning the space between these characters. I was trying to get them as large as I possibly could. And we will be getting into quite a bit on tracking and kerning when we get into text boxes, which we will be doing next week. All right, so I have this editable text, and with the text box selected with the selection tool, I go to the Type menu and choose Create Outlines. Now this looks like it's still editable text, but it is not. These are now individual graphic frames. And I'm going to remove the fill from them by bringing the fill icon to the front, clicking on No Fill, and I can see now that I have stroked. There is no stroke on it, but I can see the frame edges spelling out eagle. While this new graphics frame, it's no longer a text box or a text frame, it's now a frame, an image frame, and it's acting really more like a grouped image frame because each one of these individual pieces is a frame. But regardless, with this selected, I'm going to go to my File menu and choose Place, which is how I've been getting all of these images placed in tonight's webcast, except I'm using the keyboard equivalent, Control-D, or on the Mac it'll be Command-D. And I'm going to bring in this eagle. And you can see that the eagle now is filling up all the visible areas. Wherever there was text, that's where the image is coming through. But I'm a little short here, right? I've got this white area. So I want to click in here, and I couldn't find my content grabber. Sometimes you'll find a little piece of it sitting over here, or sometimes you'll see it in the center. So I just double-clicked somewhere on the image so that I could see the image outline. And I can see that sure enough it is too short, but I don't want it to be distorted as I increase the size. So I'm going to hold down my Shift key as I am dragging the bottom right-hand corner, which is going to increase the size of that image proportionally. And I might even make it a little bit bigger so I have a little bit of room to play with. And then I'm going to hold down my cursor. I call this the patient mode because it takes holding it down for a few seconds in order for you to see the entire image in the background. And it gives me a much better idea of where I can place this. I want to try to get as much of that eagle's wing coming through to that very first frame so that you can see the expanse of that eagle's wing. I want to get as much of the head as possible. So in this case I might even increase the size just a little bit more. And of course these are the types of things that you've got to play with when you're doing this type of a presentation, is that you're going to have to play around with this image. And what I mean about the patient mode is if I double click and then I just start dragging, notice that all I'm seeing is the outline. And that's because I didn't hold my mouse button down for a couple of seconds ahead of time. But if instead I hold my mouse down, 1 EN to 2 EN, that's about all it takes depending on how fast your video card is. Now I see that ghosted image, which is going to give me a much better idea of where that's going to fit and what is not going to fit, what is not going to be displayed. All right. I had another question which I want to cover real quickly before I close this for tonight. I'm going to just highlight some text here and significantly increase the size of it. All right. I had a question about filling text. And I'm sorry, I just assumed that we had covered this, but sometimes it's confusing when you're thinking of graphics. You've been dealing with shapes, and you think, okay, I want to fill this with a color. And then you go back to your text and you're thinking, oh, wait a minute, how was I supposed to fill this again? So remember, when you're dealing with text and you want to fill the text, not the background, you need to either select the text box and click on the T. That's very hard to see, I'm sure, in the webcast, but there's a T up here in the swatches panel. And if you go all the way back down, there's a T to the right of the little icon of a frame. With that selected, if I choose a color, the text is going to be filled. And remember, we fill text. We rarely ever stroke it unless it's very large and we're trying to do some sort of special effect on it. I'm going to undo that. Command Z. Go back, click on the frame icon. Notice whatever you click on in the swatches panel as far as icons go, it always responds at the bottom of your tools panel. So I clicked on the frame up in the swatches panel, and sure enough I get my little frame here. And now if I fill this, I'm filling the background. And as I mentioned before, to fill a piece of text, or you want to limit the number of characters that you're going to change the color, you can't use this method because it's going to change the text color. It's going to fill all the text in this text frame. So if you need to get precise about something, you're going to need to drag across exactly the number of characters that you want colorized. Make sure that the fill character is in front, not the stroke. And remember, when you've selected text with the type tool, you're going to see a stroke character that is the outline of a T versus a solid T. The solid T represents fill. The outline of a T represents the stroke of text. And I want the fill 9 times out of 10. Actually, it's closer to 85 times out of 100. I want that fill selected, not the stroke. And now I can go ahead and select a color, and just those characters are going to get that fill. So I hope that clarified that question. And I think that is it for tonight. I just want to look over my notes one last time here, make sure I haven't forgotten anything so that I don't have to do a 5-minute webcast saying, sorry guys, I forgot this. Okay, I think that's it. So the next webcast, as I said, is going to be an in-depth discussion about text wrapping so that you can use that feature in both your single 8.5 by 11 page travel flyers. All right, so until then, signing off.